The summer of 1945 arrived in Hiroshima like a whisper before a storm. Cicadas filled the heavy air with their endless hum, the sound weaving through hospital corridors, mingling with the smell of antiseptic and the faint perfume of blooming lilies outside. Within those whitewashed walls, Aiko Tanaka moved quietly between the rows of patients, her footsteps barely audible against the polished floor. She was 26, a nurse since the first days of the Pacific War, her once soft hands now calloused by years of tending to wounds that no longer shocked her. Yet beneath her calm face lived an unspoken weariness, not merely of body, but of spirit. Each bandaged soldier she touched carried fragments of stories she could no longer bear to hear. Some spoke of distant islands, others of endless seas, and some of children they would never see again. Every night she wrote in a small notebook she kept hidden in the lining of her satchel. The nurses called it her diary, but Aiko called it her confessional. In its pages, she poured her fears and questions, though she never expected anyone to read them. That changed on a humid evening in late July, when a foreign patient was brought into the hospital under strict orders. His presence was to remain secret. The soldiers who delivered him spoke in hushed tones, calling him the Shadow. He was tall, his hair a shade of light brown, unusual in Japan, and his eyes, startlingly blue even beneath fever's haze. His papers claimed he was a captured engineer from the Philippines, but his accent, when he murmured deliriously in sleep, carried something else, perhaps American, perhaps British. None dared ask. Aiko was assigned to him because she spoke a little English, learned long ago from a visiting teacher who had believed that peace came through language. Now, in a cruel twist, that small knowledge tied her to a man from the enemy side. At first, she feared him. But when she pressed a cool cloth to his forehead and he whispered a single word, "Forgive," something in her heart shifted. Days turned to nights as she cared for him. His fever broke slowly, and fragments of conversation began to surface between them. He told her his name was Thomas, though he never revealed a family name. He spoke of a weapon so powerful that the sky itself would burn. Aiko thought it fever talk, the rambling of a mind weakened by pain. But when he grabbed her wrist and whispered, "They are coming here, soon," a shiver ran down her spine. Outside the hospital, the city pulsed with fragile normalcy. Children played near the riverbanks, their laughter rising against the rumble of distant air raid drills. Fishermen repaired nets. Mothers queued for rice rations. Everyone clung to the hope that the war would end before it reached them. Hiroshima, after all, had been spared the worst of the bombings. People called it a city of fate. Aiko began to doubt that phrase. In her nightly letters, which she now addressed to her younger sister Yumi, far away in Kyoto, she began to describe Thomas, though she never used his real name. Instead, she called him the Shadow with blue eyes. She wrote about his strange warnings, about the way he watched the horizon as if waiting for something unspeakable. Her words were gentle, careful, but lined with growing unease. "Yumi, sometimes I think he knows what tomorrow holds. When I look into his eyes, it feels like standing before a storm that hasn't yet broken." On August 4th, Thomas asked for paper. His hands still trembled, but his mind was clear. Aiko hesitated, then gave him a single sheet and a pencil stub. He wrote slowly, methodically, every letter deliberate. When he finished, he folded the page twice and placed it inside a small metal locket he wore around his neck. "If I do not wake tomorrow," he said quietly, "burn this." That night, Aiko couldn't sleep. The words he had spoken kept echoing. "Burn this." The next morning, soldiers came again, not for Thomas, but for the locket. They spoke to the head physician in the hallway. The conversation was short, ending with the dull thud of boots retreating down the corridor. When Aiko returned to his room, the locket was gone. Thomas lay still, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. "It's too late now," he murmured. "They already know." Outside, an American reconnaissance plane circled high above the city, a silver speck in the cloudless blue. People looked up and pointed, unafraid. No bombs had fallen here for months. Children waved. Aiko watched from the hospital window, feeling a chill she could not explain. Over the next day, the city seemed to slow. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if holding its breath. On the evening of August 5, Aiko began her final letter. She sat by candlelight, the soft glow painting gold across her uniform. The first words came easily. If this reaches you, it means I have joined the others whose voices are now only wind. She paused often, listening to the night, to the hum of cicadas, to the rustle of paper, to the faint, rhythmic cough of Thomas sleeping in the next room. Between paragraphs, she wrote fragments of thoughts not meant to be read by anyone but her sister. Lines of apology, of hope, of confession. She wrote of the strange man and his prophecy, of her fear that something immense and final was drawing near. And near the end, she wrote a sentence that would later become legend among those who found the letter decades later. If the light comes, I will not close my eyes. The world should be seen, even in its ending. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight touched Hiroshima's quiet rooftops. Aiko sealed her letter, tied it with a piece of medical gauze, and placed it in a drawer beneath her bed. She went to check on her patients, humming softly, a habit she had when afraid. Thomas was awake. His voice was calm but urgent. "Aiko," he said, "when the sirens start, don't run. Go to the basement. Promise me." She nodded, though she didn't understand why his tone carried more sorrow than fear. The sky outside remained flawless blue. Children hurried to school with satchels bouncing. Workers cycled across the bridge toward the factory district. At 8 a.m., the hospital clock chimed its slow melody. Aiko stood by the window, adjusting a curtain, when she saw a glint far above, a flash of sunlight against metal, moving steadily across the heavens. In that fleeting moment, she thought of her sister's smile, of her mother's garden, of the patients who had survived only to face this new silence. She closed her eyes briefly and whispered, "If the light comes, I will see it." And somewhere outside, high over the calm river, a plane released its burden. The world held its breath. When the sky opened, it did not roar, it bloomed. Aiko felt the world brighten into something far beyond color, a white so pure that it seemed to erase every boundary between earth and heaven. For an instant, time folded in on itself. The air trembled, sound vanished. She could no longer tell if she was standing or falling. All that remained was light, endless, consuming, and strangely gentle, like the first morning after creation. Then came the silence. Not the kind that follows noise, but a silence so vast that it seemed to listen. In that silence, Aiko's thoughts moved with a clarity she had never known. She remembered Thomas's words, "The light will not kill us, it will reveal us." She tried to speak, perhaps to whisper a prayer, but the air itself felt suspended between breaths. She thought of her sister, of her mother's hands, of the patients who had smiled through their pain. And in that fragile stillness, she felt something release, as though the weight of all her fears had been lifted away. When awareness returned, it came like fragments of a dream. She could hear the faraway echo of wind, see faint shapes dancing through drifting dust. She did not understand what had happened, only that everything around her was changed. But the nurse within her moved by instinct. She searched for her patients, calling softly, moving through what had once been the corridor. The light had dimmed into a pale haze. Somewhere beneath that haze, she felt the pulse of life, weak, uncertain, but present. She knelt and whispered, "Hold on, please, hold on." Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, time had lost its edges. Aiko found a child beneath a fallen beam, breathing faintly. She carried the child outside toward what she thought was daylight, only to find a sky filled with drifting gray. The river glimmered faintly, and the breeze that touched her cheek was warm but weightless, as if it came from another world. She sat on the riverbank, the child in her lap, and began humming a lullaby. The same melody her mother had sung when thunder frightened her as a little girl. The child stirred, and Aiko smiled, even as exhaustion pressed against her eyes. She whispered, "It's only light, little one. Just light." Sometime later, no one could say exactly when, someone found her near the water. A doctor from the hospital, dazed but alive, saw her still form and thought she was sleeping. In her pocket, tied with a strip of gauze, was a folded letter addressed to Yumi Tanaka, Kyoto. The paper was faintly singed at the edges, but the writing remained intact. He kept it safe without knowing why. Decades later. 40 years passed before the letter was read again. In 1985, an archivist named Kenji Morimoto was cataloging wartime artifacts in the basement of a museum near Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. Among the boxes of medical records and uniforms, he found a small envelope sealed with brittle wax. Inside lay the letter, its ink faded but still graceful, the handwriting steady despite time's touch. Kenji held it carefully, reading the first line aloud. "If this reaches you, it means I have joined the others whose voices are now only wind." The words carried a strange calmness, not despair but acceptance. He could almost see the young woman who had written them, her patience, her discipline, her faith in something beyond herself. He read further, captivated by the final paragraph. "The light will not kill us, it will reveal us. For what we loved, feared, and refused to see shall stand clear as the morning. And when the wind carries our names, let it not speak of war, but of the small kindnesses that survived it." Kenji set the letter down and stared through the window toward the memorial dome. The evening sun fell across the river, turning the water to bronze. He wondered who she was, this nurse who had witnessed the unimaginable and still found beauty in forgiveness. He searched the museum's records and discovered her name among the lost staff of Hiroshima Red Cross Hospital, Aiko Tanaka, registered nurse, age 26. No body ever recovered. That night, Kenji could not sleep. He reread the letter again and again, sensing layers of meaning hidden in her words. Who was the shadow with blue eyes? Was he a spy, an engineer, a man who tried to warn her? Or was he something more symbolic, a presence representing the enemy that she learned to see as human? The mystery deepened the more he pondered it. The following week, Kenji took the letter to Yumi Tanaka, now an elderly woman living quietly in Kyoto. She listened as he introduced himself, her eyes widening when she saw the envelope. Her hands trembled as she touched the familiar handwriting. Tears welled up, not of sorrow but of recognition. "She always wrote like this," Yumi whispered. Slowly, like she was speaking to the paper. They sat together for hours, reading aloud. For Yumi, it was as if her sister had returned after 4 decades of silence. She remembered the last letter she had received before the war's end, cheerful, ordinary, full of questions about the weather. This one was different. It carried not the tone of farewell, but of prophecy. Yumi turned to Kenji and said quietly, she wasn't afraid of death. She was afraid that no one would understand what it meant. Echoes of the past. Months later, the letter was displayed in a small glass case at the museum. Visitors stopped to read, some in silence, others in tears. Among them was an elderly foreign man with pale blue eyes. His name, according to the museum logbook, was Thomas Reed. He stood before the letter for a long time, leaning slightly on his cane. When a curator approached and asked if he needed help, he simply said, "She took care of me once." Then he left without another word. No one ever saw him again. That single entry in the logbook reignited the mystery. Historians debated whether the man truly was the same Thomas Aiko had mentioned. Some believed he might have been an intelligence officer, part of the very operation that brought the weapon to Japan. Others thought he was merely an aging tourist drawn by coincidence. But for those who believed, it seemed the circle of Aiko's story had quietly closed, the nurse who wrote of light, and the stranger who had foretold it. Kenji often returned to the letter in the years that followed. He said it reminded him that history is not written only by victors, but also by the gentle souls who refuse to hate. Each time he read her words, he felt as though Aiko were whispering across time, "Remember us not for how we died, but for how we loved." Closing the first circle. In the soft glow of the museum's evening lights, Aiko's letter remains preserved, its ink fading slowly but refusing to disappear. Every August, visitors gather beneath the dome to light paper lanterns and send them floating down the river. Among the lanterns, one always bears a single inscription. The light will not kill us, it will reveal us. No one knows who writes it each year. Perhaps it is Kenji. Perhaps it is Yumi's granddaughter. Or perhaps, in some way, It is Aiko herself, her voice carried by the wind she once spoke of, reminding every soul who reads her words that even in humanity's darkest hour, compassion can still glow brighter than any fire the world can create. The first mention of Thomas Reed in Hiroshima's wartime hospital records appeared not in a patient log, but in a restricted communication file stamped by the Imperial Army Intelligence Bureau. The record, though partially burned, revealed a chilling detail: foreign national detained for questioning, possible espionage or covert research activity. Temporary medical custody at Red Cross Hospital, pending interrogation. To Aiko, however, he was not a spy. He was simply a man broken by fever and silence. She remembered the first night she tended to him, his face pale beneath the oil lamp's light, his skin burning, his eyes flickering open long enough to whisper something in English. She hadn't understood his words then, but she had felt the weight behind them, the way he said them like a confession. Over the next days, as his strength returned, they began to communicate in fragments. He knew a little Japanese, she knew a little English. The barrier between them was vast, yet somehow fragile. Through gestures, sketches, and quiet persistence, they began to exchange more than words. They exchanged truths hidden in silence. Thomas often carried a small leather notebook. Its cover was worn smooth, its pages crowded with mathematical symbols and strange circular sketches. Aiko once asked him what it was. He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "It's a dream," he said softly. "A terrible dream I helped build." She didn't ask again. But one evening, when the cicadas had grown silent and the war seemed to hum just beyond the city walls, Thomas looked at her and said, "Do you know what light can do, Aiko-san?" She tilted her head. "Heal, guide," she guessed. He nodded, then shook his head. "Yes. And also, destroy everything it touches." There was something haunted in his voice, not the voice of a soldier, but of a man who had seen what others could only imagine. She sensed that his suffering was not of the body, but of the soul. In the weeks that followed, she noticed how he would gaze toward the horizon each night, as though expecting something to fall from the sky. The secret mission. Years later, when Kenji Morimoto and the museum researchers began investigating Thomas's identity, they uncovered fragments of declassified Allied files. The name Thomas Reed appeared on several engineering rosters at Los Alamos Laboratory, the birthplace of the atomic bomb. His role, metallurgical technician, specializing in uranium containment. According to the documents, Reed vanished from his post in early 1945, reported as missing without authorization. Intelligence later suggested he had traveled eastward through China under a false identity. Some speculated he had defected, others whispered that he was trying to stop the very project he helped build. But what no record could explain was how he ended up in Hiroshima, weeks before the bomb fell. Kenji began to piece it together: the fever, the notebook, the warnings Aiko recorded in her letter. The words "the light will not kill us, it will reveal us" now sounded less poetic, more like a message, a warning encoded through compassion. Had Thomas known what was coming? Had he tried to stop it, or at least to make someone see it differently? And had Aiko, unknowingly, become his last witness, the one person who would carry his truth beyond the fire? The whisper before the storm. Aiko's last days before August 6 grew heavy with a strange tension. She noticed soldiers arriving at the hospital with unusual equipment, new radio orders, new urgency. Rumors spread among the nurses, whispers of a decisive blow, something that would end the war in one move. But no one understood what it meant. Thomas did. On the night of August 5, he asked Aiko for a candle. The power had flickered out again, and the ward was cloaked in shadow. She lit one and watched him sketch something on the back of a patient chart, concentric circles, rippling outward. "This is what I saw in my dream," he murmured. "A sun that falls to earth. The men who made it think it's victory. But it's judgment, Aiko. Judgment dressed as light." She wanted to comfort him, to tell him it was only fever returning, but something in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't madness. It was memory, the kind of memory that breaks men from within. Before dawn, Thomas was gone. No one saw him leave. Only his notebook remained on the bedside table, its final page torn out. Later that day, the sky over Hiroshima bloomed into impossible brightness, and the rest became silence. A confession decades too late. In 1986, 1 year after Aiko's letter had been rediscovered, an anonymous envelope arrived at the Hiroshima Peace Museum. It contained a small leather notebook, its cover marked with initials TR, and a note written in shaking English. This belonged to her. It was never mine to keep. Inside the notebook were pages of sketches, atomic diagrams, calculations, and halfway through, a single sentence written in Japanese characters. The light does not descend to judge us, but to reflect what we truly are. Kenji wept when he read it. The handwriting matched the fragments found in Aiko's hospital logs. It was the same mixture of English lettering and careful Japanese strokes, the fusion of two languages, two worlds that had once been enemies. He realized then that Aiko and Thomas had shared something deeper than chance. They had shared conscience. She, the nurse who healed without judgment. He, the scientist who built the unthinkable and sought redemption in the very place that would be destroyed by it. The weight of truth. When Yumi, Aiko's sister, learned of Thomas's identity, she sat for a long time in silence. Then he was one of them, she said quietly. The ones who made it. Kenji nodded. Yes. But he was also one of the few who tried to warn us. Yumi closed her eyes. Then maybe he was not one of them. Maybe he was one of us. In that moment, Kenji understood what the letter truly meant: the light will reveal us. Not as Japanese or American. Not as victim or perpetrator. But as human beings caught between invention and morality, creation and destruction. The war had ended, but the questions it left behind had never faded. What makes a man build something capable of ending worlds? What makes another choose compassion even as the world burns around her? And perhaps the greatest question of all, does forgiveness mean forgetting or remembering differently? The Museum of Shadows. Years passed. The story of Aiko and Thomas spread quietly through exhibitions and books. Visitors left origami cranes near their display, messages in multiple languages: I forgive. I remember. I understand. Kenji, now an old man himself, often stood near the exhibit, watching strangers read their letters side by side. He sometimes thought he could hear their voices in the wind, one soft and steady, the other trembling with regret. And in those moments, he realized that history isn't just made of battles or treaties. It's made of letters no one was meant to read, and voices that refuse to die. Each August 6th, at precisely 8:15 a.m., when the peace bell rings across the city, Kenji would whisper, "She kept her promise, Thomas. The light revealed us." The winter of 1995 was unusually quiet in Hiroshima. Snow fell on the Peace Memorial Park, gathering gently on the statues of children and folded cranes. Inside the museum, Kenji Morimoto sat beneath the dim light of a reading lamp, his breath forming soft clouds in the cold air. In his hands rested Aiko Tanaka's letter, the one that had traveled through decades of silence, through ashes, through time itself. Its paper had yellowed, its edges frayed, but the ink still whispered clearly, "The light will not kill us. It will reveal us." He had read those words hundreds of times, but every winter, they felt new. This time, something was different. The letter had recently been digitized for preservation, and under magnification, Kenji had noticed faint indentations, marks left by a second pen, words written beneath the surface. It was as though Aiko had pressed another page on top while writing something else, a secret message layered beneath her farewell. He leaned closer, adjusting the scanner. Slowly, invisible words began to emerge under infrared light. Phrases in English and Japanese intertwined, uneven and hesitant, like a conversation between two people sharing one piece of paper. The realization struck him like thunder. These were not only Aiko's words, they were Thomas Reed's. The invisible script seemed to respond to her letter, his handwriting fainter, rushed, almost desperate. "You were right. The light is not punishment. It is a mirror. Tell them not to build it again." Then, as if he had run out of strength, one last line: "Forgive me, Aiko. Kenji sat back in silence. His hands trembled as he stared at the overlapping letters, 2 lives written together, one in farewell, the other in confession. In that fragile convergence of ink and paper, he felt time collapsing. The nurse and the scientist, enemies by nationality but united by conscience, had written the same truth, that no nation, no ideology, no victory could justify the death of the innocent. He realized the letter was more than a relic. It was an unfinished conversation between 2 souls who had understood too late, and who had left their words behind as a warning for those who came after. Outside, the city glowed softly beneath the snow. The Peace Dome stood silent, its skeleton arch rising against the night like an open question to the heavens. Kenji folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its case. But sleep did not come easily that night. He kept hearing Aiko's voice, calm and measured, as she once wrote to her sister Yumi, "When light comes, do not close your eyes." The next morning, he decided to find Yumi once more. She lived now in a nursing home near Miyajima Island, her hair silver, her movements slow. When Kenji entered her small room, she looked up from a stack of old photographs. Her face softened. "You still carry her words," she said. "I found something new," Kenji replied quietly. Something she never meant to hide, only to wait. He told her about the invisible writing, about Thomas Reed's secret message woven into the letter. Yumi listened without interruption, her eyes glistening in the soft light. When he finished, she smiled faintly and said, "Then he did not die as an enemy." Her voice broke slightly, and she added, "Maybe that's what she wanted to tell us all along. That forgiveness is not forgetting. It's remembering without hate." They sat in silence for a long while. Outside the window, seagulls drifted above the water. The tide was low, revealing old stones from the shoreline, stones that might have once been part of homes, of streets, of lives. Hiroshima had rebuilt itself, but beneath its modern streets, memory still breathed like a heartbeat. That evening, Kenji received a phone call from a university researcher in the United States, Dr. Elaine Porter, a historian specializing in declassified wartime documents. She had been studying the disappearance of Thomas Reed for years, and her voice trembled with curiosity when Kenji mentioned the letter. "I've been searching for his trail for 2 decades, she said. "And now you're telling me his handwriting survived in Japan?" "Yes," Kenji replied. "It survived because she kept it." A few months later, Dr. Porter visited Hiroshima. She was in her late 50s, kind-eyed, with a cautious reverence that seemed to carry its own weight of inherited guilt. Together they examined the letter and notebook. Porter translated fragments, cross-referencing dates and notes from Los Alamos records. "It's him," she whispered. "No doubt. Reed wrote this after he fled. He must have reached Hiroshima weeks before the bombing." She turned the pages slowly, her fingers tracing the faded English words, "I came to warn them. I came to undo what I helped begin." When she finished, she looked at Kenji and said, "He wasn't a spy, you know. He was a witness who chose to walk into the fire." Kenji nodded. "And she was the one who saw him clearly." The two stood quietly before the display case where the diary and letter rested side by side. In that moment, the line between victim and perpetrator blurred. The stories of Aiko and Thomas no longer belonged to nations or governments, they belonged to the human heart. Months later, a new exhibition opened at the Peace Museum, 2 letters, 1 light. It displayed both Aiko's final letter and Thomas's recovered notebook. Visitors read them in silence. Some wept, others simply stood still, absorbing the fragile truth suspended between them. Beneath the glass case, a plaque bore Aiko's translated line. "The light will not kill us. It will reveal us." Every August 6th, as the city gathered for the memorial, people from all over the world left paper cranes and handwritten notes at the foot of the display. Some wrote prayers. Some wrote apologies. Others wrote promises, never again. Kenji often stood among them, listening to the quiet hum of the visitors' footsteps. He no longer felt the same sharp ache of sorrow he once carried. Instead, he felt something gentler, a peace born not of forgetting, but of understanding. He had spent years trying to interpret Aiko's final message, and now he knew. The revelation wasn't about science or guilt. It was about humanity's reflection in the light it creates. Whether that light heals or destroys depends on who holds it. As he left the museum that night, Kenji looked back once more. Through the glass, the letter seemed to glow faintly under the display lights, fragile, eternal, alive. He thought of Aiko in those final hours before the sky changed, of Thomas searching for redemption in a foreign land, and of all the nameless souls whose stories were never written down. Somewhere deep within, he heard Aiko's voice again, clear and calm. If you remember me, do not remember my death. Remember that I tried to love the world even as it ended. Kenji closed his eyes, and for the first time in decades, he felt no darkness. Only light. Spring came softly to Hiroshima, carrying with it the scent of rain and the sound of distant bells. The city, alive with cherry blossoms, seemed far removed from the ashes it had once known. Yet beneath that quiet beauty, the past continued to breathe. Each falling petal felt like a whisper, a voice from another time, another world. For Kenji Morimoto, age had not dulled his devotion to Aiko's letter. If anything, time had only deepened his sense of connection. The more he studied her words, the more he realized they were not meant for the dead, they were meant for the living. The letter had survived fire and ruin for a reason. And so had he. It was in late April, during one of his final archival projects, that Kenji came across something unexpected, a sealed envelope labeled Confidential, Los Alamos Correspondence, 1944-45. It had been donated by an American foundation to the Peace Museum's growing international archive. Inside were copies of letters exchanged between engineers, coded reports, and handwritten notes. But what caught Kenji's eye was a folded page, brittle and yellow, marked TR. At first, it seemed ordinary, technical jargon about isotope density and radiation shielding. But as Kenji read further, a pattern began to emerge. Certain words were underlined, oddly out of place. When he arranged the underlined words vertically, a message appeared, a message hidden within the official document. The light is a mirror. Forgive what it shows you. His pulse quickened. It was the same phrase Thomas had written to Aiko. The message was not just poetic, it was intentional, encoded inside military paperwork to avoid detection. Reed had embedded his conscience into the very system that sought to erase it. Kenji spent days cross-referencing the documents. He discovered that Reed's warnings had been intercepted by U.S. Army intelligence in early 1945 and filed away as irrelevant philosophical commentary. They never reached their intended recipients, the scientists or policymakers who might have understood. Instead, they were buried in bureaucracy, lost until now. It was then that Kenji realized what Thomas's missing notebook page must have contained. It wasn't a confession of guilt, it was an act of faith. He had written those words believing that someday, someone would find them and understand. And that person had turned out to be Aiko. Years passed. Kenji's health began to fade, but his determination did not. Every day he returned to the Peace Museum, walking slowly beneath the vast photographs of the past. Visitors would sometimes recognize him as the curator who discovered the nurse's letter. He would smile politely, though he never felt like a discoverer, only a messenger. One afternoon, while reviewing translations of the newly found documents, he received a letter postmarked from the United States. It was from Dr. Elaine Porter, the historian who had once helped him decode the original letter. She had found something extraordinary in Reed's old family papers, a photograph dated 1945. In it, Thomas stood beside a group of Japanese doctors outside the Red Cross hospital. His expression was weary but calm. Behind him, almost out of focus, was Aiko Tanaka, smiling faintly, holding a clipboard. It was the only photograph that proved they had truly known each other, that their brief intersection of lives had been real, not legend. Kenji stared at the image for a long time. Then, without a word, he placed it inside the museum's growing collection, beneath a plaque that read, "Those who remember are those who heal." That night, as rain fell softly against the windows, he took out Aiko's letter once more. The ink had grown faint, the strokes almost dissolving into the paper. He traced her words gently with his fingertips and read aloud the final line, "The light will not kill us. It will reveal us." At that moment, he understood fully. The light Aiko spoke of was not the bomb. It was truth. The truth that destroys illusions but also sets the spirit free. The truth that shows humanity not as monsters or martyrs, but as fragile beings capable of both devastation and grace. She had written those words not as prophecy, but as forgiveness for all of them, for all of us. In the summer of 2005, the Peace Museum held a special commemoration, the 60th anniversary of the bombing. Thousands gathered in silence as paper lanterns floated across the river. Among them were children who had never known war, veterans who could no longer speak, and foreigners who had come from across the world to pay their respects. Kenji, frail but determined, stood at the podium. The crowd waited as he unfolded a single piece of paper, a copy of Aiko's letter. His voice trembled, but it carried through the still air. "She wrote these words not knowing if anyone would ever read them," he said. "But perhaps she knew that someday, they would find their way back to the living. To remind us that the greatest power humanity holds is not destruction, but remembrance and compassion." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces illuminated by candlelight. "She ended her letter with these words," he continued softly. "The light will not kill us. It will reveal us." I believe she meant that even in our darkest moments, what survives is not death, but truth. The truth of who we are, and what we choose to become. When he stepped down, the audience remained silent for several seconds before applause rippled through the night air. Some wept openly, others bowed their heads. The moment was neither victory nor grief, it was understanding. As Kenji walked back toward the river, he saw a young girl kneeling to release her lantern into the water. She looked up and smiled at him. "Sensei," she asked, "will the light go to the sky?" Kenji smiled faintly. "No, little one," he said. "The light stays with us." He watched the lantern drift away, its reflection shimmering on the dark water. Around him, hundreds more followed, until the river itself seemed to glow, a ribbon of light winding through the city, carrying memories forward. That night, alone in his small apartment, Kenji passed away peacefully in his sleep. On the desk beside him rested Aiko's letter, Thomas's notebook, and a small photograph of the two of them, the nurse and the scientist, captured in a moment that history had almost erased. When museum staff found him the next morning, they noticed something strange. The morning sun, streaming through the blinds, fell directly on the letter's glass frame, illuminating the faded ink until it shimmered faintly, as if glowing from within. No one could explain it. But perhaps, in that quiet room, light had simply done what Aiko said it would all along, it revealed. Years later, visitors to the Hiroshima Peace Museum still paused before the display marked the nurse and the scientist. Some read the letter silently, others bowed their heads. Beside the glass, a small inscription reads in both Japanese and English. "We are not destroyed by light. We are remembered by it." And somewhere, in the stillness of history, Aiko Tanaka's words continue to echo, gentle, eternal, unbroken. "The light will not kill us. It will reveal us."